Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is my distinct pleasure to present to you the Subaru. Because it's a supercharged Subaru, so it's the Subaru. What you just witnessed is the culmination of by far my most complicated automotive project to date. This is an Eaton M90. It's a junkyard supercharger that was originally fitted to various GM vehicles, such as the Pontiac Grand Prix GTP and the Buick Regal GS. In other words, you can get them for dirt cheap at the junkyard. It's bolted down to a custom intake manifold that I designed and fabricated myself, if you couldn't tell by the stellar weld quality. All of this is fitted in my 99 Subaru Legacy. In a previous video, I had swapped a 2009 Subaru 6-cylinder boxer engine into it, known as the EZ30R. In this episode, we'll be diving into this supercharger build, how it all came together, and most importantly, how it all runs. Fabricating something this complicated is a pretty intimidating task. I don't really have a ton of experience with fabrication in general, again, look at the welds, but you gotta start somewhere. This probably looks like a complicated setup, but it's really quite simple. This supercharger is what's called a Roots-style blower. It bolts directly onto the intake manifold. A serpentine belt spins a pulley on the snout, which turns these rotors on the inside, and as they turn, they suck air in from the back of the unit, usually through a throttle body, and squish it out the bottom into the intake manifold, making boost. Now, obviously, there was no way to mount this thing to the factory intake manifold, so I had to get creative. Thus, I opted to create an entire intake manifold from scratch. This intake manifold takes inspiration from what are known as sheet metal intake manifolds. Rather than a cast aluminum intake manifold, such as this one, or a plastic injection molded manifold, like the one this engine came with, these sheet metal manifolds are made from common sheet stock, bar stock, tube and pipe stock, in either steel or aluminum. In their simplest form, they're essentially a box with tubes, a head flange, and a throttle body. And that's basically what mine is, other than the fact that I tossed a supercharger into the mix. While there's a lot that goes into this build, when you break it down to its bare essentials, it's really quite simple. I started by mocking things up, basically out of wood, and then I'd measure that mock-up and draw it in CAD. The core design is based on these two plates, the upper and the lower. The upper plate has the supercharger flange, which the supercharger directly bolts to. The lower has the 6 holes for each intake runner tube that goes down to the heads. Again, just a box with tubes. These two plates form the majority of our box per se. Then we'd just take some regular aluminum flat bar stock and bend and weld it around the perimeter to close the sides in. As for the intake runner themselves, or the tubes, that's just regular old Schedule 40 aluminum pipe that I heated up and squeezed in my bench vise to get that oval shape. And finally, we have the head flanges at the bottom. And that's about it. Now, getting things dimensionally accurate is pretty important, especially for the head flanges and the supercharger flange. If I were to goof something up, the flanges may not line up on the heads, or the supercharger pulley may not line up with the serpentine belt. Sure, you could measure everything by hand, but that's a tedious and potentially error-prone process. So, for the flanges, I used a method where I scanned the objects instead of measuring them. No, not with a 3D scanner. We don't got that kind of money here. Just a regular old document scanner. Then I import the image into CAD and trace over all the holes and whatever. In the case of the supercharger, I actually just bought a gasket for it and scanned that. For the intake manifold, well, it doesn't have gaskets because it uses O-rings to seal. So instead, I literally scanned the entire manifold flange on the scanner. But a scan alone doesn't really have any actual size data, right? It's just a picture. How do you know how far a millimeter actually is in a picture? And the answer is, you also just scan a ruler. Then, in CAD, you can scale the image pretty accurately to its real dimensions and just start tracing. And the tracing process is pretty simple. Now, once I had those traced into a real drawing, I had to make sure the drawings were actually accurate. Now, for the head flanges, I actually just 3D printed one. And then I took this and bolted it down to the head with no issues, meaning the design was probably fine. The supercharger flange is too big to 3D print, so instead I used a technology called 2D printing, also known as printing. I just kind of held this up to the bottom of the supercharger and it looked fine, meaning that the design was probably good as well. So now that we have everything designed, we gotta fabricate it. Now this whole thing was effectively designed to be 2D, right? Like the top plate, the bottom plate, the flanges, and all of those can be cut out of aluminum plate stock. which is intentional. So you could print out all the designs and glue them to some aluminum plate and then use a saw and a drill to cut the designs out of the aluminum, which is all well and good, but what I ended up doing was sending the designs to a company that then used a fiber laser to cut them out of 3/8 inch thick aluminum plate. So essentially, I uploaded my designs to their site and then they mailed me the parts in exchange for money. Then I just had to weld everything together and tap the holes and such. And then boom, I had the intake manifold. Here's some videos from the process. Okay, so here's what I got. These are the flanges that will bolt to the head, each one. This is the upper plate, which the supercharger obviously bolts to, which is then welded, spaced apart, of course, to the bottom plate, which has basically the holes that the tubes will sit under, so this will be spaced up above those flanges for the air to flow through. The way that I'm going to make the box, right, we said the box, is to use just regular flat bar aluminum. So this is just going to be bent and wrapped around the perimeter, and it'll be welded on the edge here and the edge here, and it'll hold it spaced up so there's an area in the middle for the pressurized air to flow into each runner through the box. And then the tubes that go here and then eventually are welded to the bottom side. So this one would be welded to the bottom side of this here. That's just going to be regular old aluminum tube stock, 2-inch in diameter. And that should do it. So there's a couple of problems I have to address with this design during fabrication. And the first is, how far spread apart do these need to be? Now I'm using 2-inch aluminum flat bar stock, basically this stuff right here, and I'm just going to wrap it and bend it around the perimeter and just weld it along the seam. So I need to space these apart in a manner that kind of puts this right in the middle, like so. And in order to do so, there's a number of ways. I found that actually just sticking a 2x4 under there is pretty close, but that's not very accurate, right? So something that's moderately more accurate is just 3D printing. So I have these little widgets that I printed. They're just cylinders that are, like 40 millimeters high. And 3D printing's close enough for the tolerances I need. And I have a number of them just kind of spaced under here that hold it up at about the right distance, which is all well and good. So we're calibrated here. This is good. But now we have a problem where this can kind of shimmy and it'll be off, which would be bad, right? That would unalign the supercharger and mess everything up. The bar stock wouldn't wrap around cleanly. Now, of course, I designed these, so what I can do is effectively just make like an alignment jig, such as this. And now, this is, of course, touching the bottom and the top one, so I can kind of push this and this. And once these are all nice and snug, it's all aligned up. So now, both plates should be pretty true to each other, like you'd expect. Obviously, a lot of this stuff won't survive the welding process, so I just got to kind of use it sparingly. Maybe get some tack welds or put some temporary pieces around the edges to hold it in the right position, but this is enough. This is all right for what I'm doing. All right, progress is being made. Now what I started with was just tacking a few plates in place to hold everything square. After using those 3D printed jigs, I put these on just to hold it together because I'm moving this thing around and banging it around. The plastic just wouldn't survive that. And then I went ahead and started welding the flat bar all around, tacking it every now and then bending it effectively just by pushing it down with my arm and then clamping it with this clamp. So I'll keep doing that until it's all the way around. I'll probably have to use another piece, but once it's all the way around, we should be good, I think. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate to you guys a process I call imprinting. Say we need to make a flange for this, which I actually do to connect this rubber hose to the vacuum on the other side. I could try and measure this out and draw it in CAD and print it out and then, glue it to a piece of metal and cut it. But there is an easier way. So you get yourself a piece of paper, you set it down on the flange here, and you get yourself a dirty finger, and you kind of just start rubbing. And as you can see, as I rub with my dirty hands and fingers, I eventually get the imprint of the flange pushed through the paper. And basically what you're left with is something like this. A pretty accurate representation of what the actual piece is, and then you can glue this to a piece of metal, drill the holes where they're supposed to be, and then cut around the circumference, and you're all good to go. And my finished product looks like this. It's threaded in the center here, so I can take this piece, put it on, and as you can see it fits pretty dang well. And then I tapped it with 1/8 inch NPT so I can just kind of thread this guy in there, and then boom, I have a place for this hose to go. Behold, an actually cold air intake. One that doesn't just sit here and suck hot air from the radiator, but instead pulls nice cool air from the fender. That's the good stuff. Now up next was actually bolting it to the engine, which involves finding a way to actually seal the manifold flanges to the heads. Now the factory setup used O-rings, which sat in grooves in the manifold flanges, which my flanges don't have. They're just flat plate stock after all. Now one could just slather RTV on there and send it, but that's what a caveman would do. And I'd like to think of myself as a bit more refined and resourceful than that. So I figured I'd cut some gaskets out of a sheet of gasket material. And sure, I could cut those by hand, but I have the flange drawings already. So instead, I sent those to my vinyl cutter and used that to cut the gasket, which actually worked pretty well. One interesting thing with a Roots style supercharger like this one is that the throttle body is attached directly to it. Now, of course, the factory Subaru throttle body won't just bolt to it, and the one that it normally comes with is a cable style throttle body. I prefer electronic throttle bodies as they work well with my standalone ECUs, so I wanted to find a way to use one of those. One might assume that a Gen 3 LS throttle body would fit. After all, they have a similar triangular bolt pattern, but it doesn't. It's completely different. Trust me, I bought one to check. So I instead drew both the Subaru and the Supercharger throttle body patterns in CAD, lined them up in the center, and printed this guide out. Then I glued it to the back of the Supercharger, drilled, tapped, and now the Subaru throttle body bolts right to it. Easy. The last thing was finding the right size belt for this setup. So the belt system itself was pretty simple. Normally your air conditioning compressor is right here, and the belt kind of pulls out and wraps around it, and effectively I just kind of pulled that up here. Now I had to add an idler here, which is just made out of some spare angle iron and another pulley. And what he does is just keeps this belt from rubbing right here and here, because otherwise these would want to touch in the middle. He also gives me a way to manually tension by just adding a couple washers if there's too much slop in the belt and the spring tensioner down there doesn't have enough throw to keep everything taut. As for actually picking the belt, well, that's pretty easy. You basically just take a string and wind it through the system like you would a belt. And then you cut the string so that it has the full circumference, and you just take that, you measure it, and then you can look that belt up on most auto parts websites and even go pick it up locally. I got this belt locally. Now keep in mind, you do have to get the right number of rib belt. This is a 6 rib. And when I went into this, I thought, well, man, you got to make sure that the size of the ribs are the right size, because some might have wider ones or smaller ones. No, that's not the case. As it turns out, most of these are just the same rib size. Everybody seems to follow some sort of standard, and then you just pick the right count of ribs. And there we go, Supercharged Subaru. Kinda. There were some kinks that we had to work out. The first being a pretty sizable vacuum leak. Here's the first start video where you can hear a whistling sound. That whiny, whistly sound, that's not the sound of the supercharger. That's the sound of a vacuum leak. And it ended up being on one of the flanges. Turns out the gaskets I made didn't seal too well, maybe because one of the flanges got warped during welding, I don't know. So I ended up just slathering them in RTV anyway. Onga bonga, me like silicone. And the result is a running and driving car. But we still have a problem. In the last video, we set this car up to run on E85 and discovered that in doing so, we couldn't rev this thing out past 5,500 RPM because we were maxing out our injectors. And now that we've added boost, we are even worse off. More air from the boost means that we need more fuel, so we gotta get bigger injectors. Now, under normal circumstances, you can just go and buy a set of larger aftermarket performance injectors, but this Subaru horizontal 6-cylinder doesn't have very good aftermarket support. Not many people play with these engines. So aftermarket options are few and expensive. So again, I had to get creative. Right off the bat, I noticed that these factory H6 injectors look mighty similar to the factory Subaru WRX STI injectors, aka the STI Pinks. The stock H6 injectors flow about 260 cc of fuel a minute, while the STI Pinks flow 565 cc, which is good. That's a big step up. However, I only have 4 of them because, you know, they came from a 4-cylinder engine. I'd need to get 2 more from somewhere else, and guys, I'm impatient. I don't got time to wait around for injectors to get shipped to me. I want to drive my car now. So I decided to modify the factory injectors using a process known as decapping, where you basically remove this atomizing spray screen on the end of the injector in an attempt to achieve greater flow, that is, a higher cc per minute number. Now this process is a bit destructive. This screen is like laser welded on or something, so the easiest way to get it off is to apparently grind it off. The way I did it was to pop the injector into the drill chuck, and then spin it up and grind that screen off on the belt sander. Long story short, it worked. They went from flowing 260cc to 670cc, which is a ton more, even more than those STI Pink injectors. However, in the process, one of these things slipped out of the chuck and slammed onto the concrete directly onto its stupid little injector face, which caused it to start leaking, and of course, I didn't have any spares. So in the end, I still had to wait for shipping for another one to decap and replace the leaky one with. Sometimes you just can't win. Now, this whole process was actually pretty interesting, so I kind of rushed through it in order to get this thing going, so I don't really have much footage of it. Let me know down below if you guys want to see more about injector decapping. Maybe I can make a video on that or something. So, now that we have our fueling sorted, it's time for the first real drive. Filming? Yep. That sounds awesome, doesn't it? One minor issue. It's only making 3 pounds of boost. And this wasn't entirely unexpected. Before this whole project, I tried to use an online calculator to see how much boost this setup would make. And it gave me so many goofy results that I have no idea what would happen, and I would just have to cross those bridges as I build them. Now, there are 2 ways we can go about increasing the boost with this setup. A bigger crank pulley, or a smaller supercharger pulley, both of which are just ways to spin the thing faster. Technically, I could fabricate a bigger crank pulley, however, this isn't really an option because the front timing cover casting sort of wraps around it, basically limiting it to this size. So the only other option is to install a smaller pulley on the supercharger. And thankfully, this is a very common upgrade path for the cars these came off of, so I was able to order the parts to do that really easily. And that smaller pulley resulted in this. We now see a peak of somewhere between 8 and 9 psi, which tends to taper off to around 7 psi up high. And that's it. That's how I supercharged my Subaru. Now, as far as how it runs, I think you all know the answer. This thing is a riot. That first gear pull hits you like a train. Even before I supercharged this thing, it was a joy. The H6 makes plenty of power, and with a manual, it's a fun and peppy car. The blower amplifies that feeling by a factor of 10. When you punch it, you hear that glorious sound just like... Oh yeah, that's the stuff. What's pretty interesting is how it behaves throughout the rev range. As we saw in my video about this engine having VTEC, this thing loves the higher revs, and that's still true with the blower. And yeah, it definitely has more power down low too. We have boost as soon as we stand on it, but man, in those high revs, this thing just sings. Each time you bang through a gear, that supercharger is like, let me sing you the song of my people. It's good. It's really good. Now, that being said, this isn't going to be the fastest car in the world. I chose to supercharge this car for a number of good reasons. First, the engine. The internals these things come with aren't exactly stellar. Like, I'm pretty sure they come with the world's dinkiest rods. So it ain't going to handle all that much boost to begin with. Second, the trans. This still has a factory Subaru 5-speed, which I believe are made exclusively from paper mache and glass. Third, the injectors. The decapped injectors are at about 80% duty cycle at this boost level, so they're pretty well suited for this level of power anymore, and we'd probably have to look into alternatives. Fourth is me. I cannot be trusted with a turbo. With this setup, I'd have to get crafty on turning up the power. Machining the supercharger snout, making custom pulleys, it'd take a lot for me to turn up the boost. But with a turbo, it's as easy as just opening up the laptop and maybe changing that 8 to a 10 or a 12 or heck a 14. Why not? It's running great. Until I send a rod straight into low Earth orbit. I've done it before and I'll do it again. And I can already hear a bunch of you typing, but superchargers are parasitic and turbos are better. So allow me to offer a rebuttal. So this car was never meant to make big numbers. That's what I have my LS swapped RX-8 for. Although this thing would spank the RX-8 out of the hole. The RX-8 in first just spins. This doesn't spin. All-wheel drive, baby. So the moral of the story is you don't gotta have big numbers to have big fun. And this thing is hilariously fun. People love it.
Huh?
And justifiably, it's a cool and unique build. Now, here's some quick numbers. I've got around $1,300 into this project. The biggest expense was the laser cut aluminum, coming in at around $600, followed by the refurb eBay supercharger at $200. The rest goes to consumables and materials, tools and such not included. This project clocked in at just under 4 weeks, taking 26 days. If you like this build, be sure to check out some of the others on my channel. I've got all sorts of fun things like LS swapped RX-8s and K swapped Subarus. And if you liked this video, you'd probably like some of my others. If only there was a way for you to get alerts on when I upload them. Pity. Also, if you think this shirt is funny, that's because it is, and I'm hilarious. You can buy one using the link below. That's the best way you can support me and my projects. I don't really have any further plans for this car. It's at a pretty good stopping point to just drive it and enjoy it, especially in the winter. But until then, I leave you with this. A collection of clips of me ripping this thing around. Bye for now.